Hey guys, Lone Star here with my Season 12 Syndra Rune Guide. A little bit about me. I managed to hit Masters one-tricking Syndra, and I have a fairly good idea of which rune choice is the best in each situation, and how you want to play each lane with each rune. There are three main rune pages that you'll take on Syndra, those being Electrocute, Summon Aery, and Phase Rush. I generally recommend Electrocute for people who are in a lower elo and people who are new to Syndra. I recommend Summon Aery for people in high elo and people who have a lot of experience playing her. Phase Rush isn't as good after the nerfs and is fairly matchup dependent now, but it is still viable to take Phase Rush in most games if you have a more scaling playstyle. I would also like to note that all three rune choices are fine in most matchups as long as you adjust your playstyle based on your rune choice. You may find that even a different rune page works better for you, and that's great. I would also like to note that the specifics in this video are my personal opinion and match my playstyle with Syndra. You can try all the rune pages out and even ones that are not listed in this video and see which setup works best for you in each matchup. Electrocute is great on Syndra because of how well it synergizes with her kit. Electrocute is great for both short, bursty trades and for one-shotting opponents, both of which Syndra is good at. You generally want to play the lane for these short, bursty trades instead of for slowly poking the enemy out of lane with your Q. Electrocute lets you punish the enemy mid's position very easily, especially in lower elo where enemies frequently miss position. The extra damage also helps you win the 1v1 against most assassins where the one shot is necessary. It also lets you one-shot most squishy champs in the mid game, which allows you to snowball the game. The main weakness of Electrocute is that your offense is your defense, meaning you get no additional mobility or survivability. You will also have to choose between going Sorcery and Inspiration Secondary, which limits either your early priority or your mana pool depending on which option you choose. I will go into more detail about this shortly. Additionally, you need to play slow the first few levels, which means it's generally not as good as Aery or Phase Rush for early lane aggression, and this becomes a bigger problem as you get higher rank. Your game plan with Electrocute should be a bit of a slower early game where you mainly focus on getting all of the farm in the first few levels. You still want to get a bit of poke on the enemy with your Q when it's free, but make sure you don't run out of mana. You should still get priority on the wave in most matchups even with this slightly slower playstyle. You generally want to take burst trades when mana flow band is up so you can proc Electrocute and not run out of mana. You slowly poke the enemy out of lane with these burst trades rather than with constant Q harass. You can start trying to solo kill the enemy around levels 4 and 6. As far as starting items go, you generally start Doran's Ring and 2 health potions with Electrocute because you play a slower early game. You can still go Corrupting Potion into certain matchups, and if you are high elo, you probably still want to go Corrupting Potion and Time Warp Tonic. You usually want to go Ignite if you go Electrocute so you can solo kill and one-shot the enemy more reliably. You can still go Teleport if that fits your playstyle and if the matchup warrants it. Cleanse is also always an option against champions like Zoe or Lux and against teams with a lot of crowd control. As far as the specific runes you will go with Electrocute and the benefit of each rune, Electrocute gives you a lot more laning power and mid-game one-shot potential. In lane, it is great for short and burst-oriented trades. I personally prefer Cheap Shot because of its extra damage, which allows you to get better trading and one-shot potential, but Taste of Blood is still really good for sustain and is great in certain matchups. Overall, it's up to your personal preference. Eyeball Collection is the standard on Syndra, however, you can still go Ghost Poro and Zombie Ward if you prefer those. I've personally found that Relentless Hunter is the best option for Syndra, especially when you go Ignite. Syndra has very low base movement speed, and Relentless Hunter allows you to rotate much faster. You can still opt for Ultimate Hunter if that's your personal preference, and I recommend Ultimate Hunter if you take Electrocute and Teleport. This is especially true after the removal of Ravenous Hunter. Ingenious Hunter is okay on Syndra, but it doesn't really synergize with her kit as well as it does on other champions. It does reduce the cooldown on Luden's passive, Zhonya's active, and the Everfrost active if you do plan to buy that mythic. These can be very nice, but I do feel the other options are superior. Treasure Hunter seems like it is an okay rune on Syndra, and it just seems like more of a win more option. It doesn't really synergize as well with Syndra's kit as other champions because she wants to play to dominate lane and not to roam. You usually want to opt for Sorcery Tree secondary with Mana Flow Band and Transcendence. You can swap Transcendence for Absolute Focus for a little bit more damage. However, I've found the extra ability haste to be great for mid and late game team fights. You can also take Inspiration secondary with Time Warp Tonic and Biscuit Delivery. This allows you to heavy trade in the first few levels and get more early lane priority. However, you lose out on the extra mana from Sorcery Tree. I'd really only recommend this to players Masters Plus, where early lane priority is a lot more important, and the enemy mid is more likely to contest your push. As far as rune shards go, I prefer the attack speed first, so that the farming is just a little bit smoother, so you can auto the minions a bit more for wave control, and so it's a little bit easier to weave in auto attacks during fights and skirmishes. The adaptive damage is still a great option if you want a bit more one-shot potential and for your abilities to do a little bit more damage, and this is really up to your personal preference. Second, you almost always want to go for the adaptive damage since Syndra uses her offense as her defense. You really need to be able to do high damage. Going for the armor or magic resist shard second is going to reduce your damage way too much. And third, you generally want to take either armor or magic resist depending on who the enemy laner is and what kind of damage they do. You can always take the health shard if you don't know who the enemy mid is though. As far as summon Aery goes, it is amazing at letting you poke the enemy out of lane. You can get priority into essentially every single lane early. You outpoke and outtrade most champions the first few levels, and you can even solo kill the enemy before level 6 if you play it right. You generally use this poke to get a CS and experience lead, then you can force the enemy to take bad resets, and then you get favorable roams and skirmishes off, and potentially even solo kill the enemy. As far as the weaknesses of Aery, the most obvious weakness is similar to Electrocute. You really get no extra survivability or mobility, which is Syndra's main weakness as a champion. While Aery does let you get ahead in the laning phase, the rune itself doesn't do too much for you outside of the laning phase. You really need to be able to constantly proc Aery and poke the enemy to get much use out of it, and it doesn't really do too much in a burst combo. As far as your game plan goes when you play Aery Syndra, you want to play for a very strong lane opening. You want to generally push the enemy in and try to harass them as much as possible with your Q and auto attacks, while still making sure you farm well and don't run out of mana. You want to try to deny the enemy as many resources as possible. And when I say resources, I mean making sure they lose farm, health, experience, and roam opportunities. Aery Syndra is one of the biggest lane bullies in the game, so make sure you play extremely aggressive while still not dying to ganks. It can sometimes be hard to actually kill the enemy with Aery because they will likely reset after you poke them down a bit, but before you can really kill them. This does often force the enemy to take bad resets, which is still very good. You do have the ability to solo kill an enemy if they make a mistake or position too aggressively. You will likely have to kill them slowly over the course of a few combos rather than one-shotting them, since Aery does not add much damage to any single combo. You can still one-shot when the enemy is very squishy or if you are already really far ahead of the opponent. As far as starting items, you generally want to start Corrupting Potion and go Time Warp Tonic, since they synergize very well with the poke playstyle that Aery has. You can still go Doran's Ring and 2 potions if you want, but it's definitely not optimal. As far as spells go, I generally recommend Teleport when you run Aery. People usually run Teleport with Aery because it's much better at impacting the map, and since it's oftentimes very difficult to kill the enemy in high elo. In these cases, it's better to go Teleport because you can get a lot more small wins over the enemy and then also impact the map more. Ignite does give you a bit of kill pressure and lets you snowball your lane a little bit better, and for that reason I think it's still viable, especially if you go Aery in Diamond or below. Cleanse is still situationally good into teams with targeted crowd control. Going into the specific rune page, Aery is great at poking the enemy, but doesn't really scale or give you any survivability. You want to slowly poke the enemy with Q and auto attacks to get a resource advantage, and then translate that resource advantage into kills, roams, etc. The best second rune you can take would be Mana Flow Band because it allows you to poke the enemy a lot more in lane with more mana. However, Nullifying Orb is still decent into high AP enemy team comps and into AP assassins like Fizz. Again, as I described in the Electrocute page, Transcendence is still the best standard third option because the ability haste is really useful, but you can still take Absolute Focus if you want a little bit more damage. As far as the fourth option you go, it's a bit more controversial. I generally think Scorch is a really good option in high elo because it helps make sure that you can poke the enemy out of lane, but it does come at the cost that it scales very poorly. I really only can recommend taking Scorch if you're at least Diamond Plus. Gathering Storm is much better in low elo since it's so much more consistent and guaranteed to be useful later on, and it's still a really good option in high elo just to make sure that you do scale better. Secondary, you almost always want to go Inspiration with Time Warp Tonic and buy Corrupting Potion. This is almost necessary for the hyper-aggressive poke playstyle that Aery entails, especially if the enemy goes Time Warp Tonic and Corrupting Potion themselves. You could always swap Time Warp Tonic with Cosmic Insight if you want, but I definitely don't recommend it. Biscuit Delivery is very nice to make sure you don't run out of mana early game, but any of the other options on the right are still viable if you don't want to go Biscuit Delivery. And again, the shards are going to be the same with Aery as they were with Electrocute. Personal preference dictates whether or not you want to take the attack speed or the adaptive force, and then take armor or magic resist depending on the lane matchup. Phase Rush gives you much better scaling than both Electrocute and Aery, while also giving you more safety in the laning phase. It allows you to match opponents in the side lane much better later in the game. Phase Rush also allows you to kite opponents better, meaning you are allowed to get your damage off on them and then run away quickly before they can damage you back. Phase Rush is also really good at escaping champions like Olaf and Tryndamere who just want to run you down. Phase Rush is generally weaker than Electrocute and Aery because it doesn't really help you win the 1v1 in most matchups. It mostly just lets you scale better, so that way you can side lane more efficiently and reposition better in team fights. A lack of damage from your runes means that you also can't solo kill the enemies quite as easily, and this gives you a lot less impact in the early game. This means that a lot of games will just spiral out of control before you even get to scale. The nerfs to Phase Rush and the changes to Archangels made the scaling approach of playing Syndra much more situational, but Phase Rush is still viable every game if it better fits your playstyle. I usually decide to run Phase Rush because the enemy jungler wants to run me down, but Phase Rush is also still really good into certain mid matchups where you really want to kite them. As far as your game plan goes when you play Phase Rush, the early lane opening is going to be very similar to Aery. You do want to play for scale with Phase Rush, but you want to play for a very strong lane opening because you are still a lane bully. You still get priority on the first few levels in most matchups, and you want to play faster than you would with Electrocute. This means a lot of heavy trading and a lot of resets. You will still have the ability to solo kill the enemy, but this is mostly based off their mistakes, and you are more likely to pick up kills in skirmishes and team fights. Syndra generally reaches the point where she started to have scaled once she gets her Ludens in her tier 2 boots, which are usually the Sork boots. At this point, you will be able to do a lot of damage in team fights with these items, and you will potentially even be able to one-shot the enemy. You will also get a large power spike every time you max an ability due to your passive. She continues to scale well into the mid game, and she does have a solid late game. However, other mages do often outscale her in team fights, so just be aware of that. As far as items go, you generally want to go Corrupting Potion for the same reasons you do when you take Aery. It gives you the ability to bully opponents early on, especially when you don't take the damage runes. As far as spells go, you almost always want to go Teleport with Phase Rush because you're playing to scale. If you want to play aggressive and go for solo kills with Ignite, you're better off playing with Aery or Electrocute anyway. Cleanse is still situationally good into certain champs and into certain team comps. As far as the actual rune tree goes, it's going to be very similar to what you do with Aery. Phase Rush itself scales extremely well and gives you great survivability, but you do lose out on some of the lane control and one-shot potential you get from Aery and Electrocute. You still have very good laning with Scorch, Corrupting Potion, and Time Warp Tonic, but you do lose a bit of that kill pressure, especially because you don't really need that extra damage to be able to kill the opponent. I still recommend going Mana Flow Band second, just because the mana makes it a lot more manageable to play the laning phase and the mid-late game. But you can still go Nullifying Orb into certain matchups and into heavy AP team comps. The extra ability haste from Transcendence definitely makes it the best option, but Absolute Focus is still viable if you want a little bit more damage. As far as picking between Scorch and Gathering Storm, I really like Scorch with the Phase Rush setup because Scorch allows you to reach the point where you scale a lot more easily. You are already foregoing a lot of the damage by picking Phase Rush over Aery and Electrocute, so the extra damage from Scorch allows you to reach the point where you scale a lot more easily. Gathering Storm definitely complements the scaling nature of the Phase Rush rune page, but you will have a bit of a harder time reaching the point that you scale if you go Gathering Storm, since you lose out on all damage runes. I like to go Scorch because it helps give a little bit of power into my laning phase to ensure I do get to the point where I scale. I generally still only recommend Scorch to players who are Diamond Plus, and Gathering Storm is just much better in lower ranks since it's a lot harder to make full use of Scorch. Gathering Storm is also still a great option in high elo because it does scale way better than Scorch. You generally want to go for Inspiration Tree secondary with Time Warp Tonic and Biscuits. Time Warp Tonic is recommended because it compensates for your lack of early game rune damage, and Biscuit Delivery allows you to get more mana back and stay in lane longer. That way you can use more Qs on the wave and use more Qs to harass the enemy. You can also swap any of these around based on your personal preference and playstyle, however this is the best combination that I have found so far. And again, the shards you take are going to be the same as you would with Electrocute and Aery. I personally prefer the attack speed over Adaptive Force, but whatever you prefer, you go for Adaptive secondary, and then you pick Armor or Magic Resist depending on the type of damage your lane opponent does. Syndra has a very versatile kit and can go other runes than the main three I listed before, and the other main ones that she can go are First Strike, Arcane Comet, and Predator. First Strike is nice because it allows you to play for scaling and allows you to reach your key item spikes a lot sooner. However, your laning is going to be a lot worse without any extra damage. Usually I'm going to go Phase Rush if I want to scale because I want to have that mobility rather than reaching my item spike sooner. But you can definitely go First Strike if that's more of your playstyle. Arcane Comet is very similar to Aery, but has worse early game and better late game. It's very similar to Electrocute, but you only have to land one ability instead of 3 to proc it. You generally see Arcane Comet on Syndra when you play Syndra bot lane. Predator is not something you see very often, but you do see it every now and again on Syndra ever since Showmaker took it in Worlds. It's really only good if you plan to roam a lot and ignore lane, but Syndra is more of a lane bully, so roaming a lot doesn't really match Syndra's identity, so I'm not really a big fan of it. You can definitely go it against champions that want to roam a lot, like Twisted Fate or Galio. You can also find my MOBA fire guide for Syndra in the description down below. I go over almost anything you could want to know about Syndra, including matchups, runes, summoner spells, abilities, combos, your build path, and generally how you want to play the game. You can also find my Syndra matchup spreadsheet in the description where I go over more than 80 of her most common matchups and give you tips on how to beat them, the difficulty, the runes and summoners that I suggest, and some build tips against them. As always, please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, as it really helps me grow my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next one.